This is a discussion of Chapter 8 from Lord of the Flies, and Chapter 8 picks up right after Ralph and Jack and Roger have gone to the top of the mountain, and in the evening light they see what they perceive to be an actual beast, when in fact of matter it's the dead parachuter that falls down on the island at the very beginning of Chapter 6. Piggy says, are you sure? Are you really sure? And Ralph says, we saw it. The beast had teeth, and Ralph said, big black eyes. Piggy says, what are we going to do? When Ralph responds to this, it says he turned towards the platform. The conch glimmered among the trees, a white blob against the place where the sun would rise. And in this moment, Golding describes the conch as a white blob. And at the end of the chapter, we're going to discuss this a little bit more. Ralph and Jack start to have a disagreement, and Jack gets fed up with Ralph, and so you see the sound of the inexpertly blown conch interrupted them. Jack went on blowing till the shelters were astir and the hunters crept to the platform. So Jack calls a meeting, and he seeks to do so using the rules. He utilizes the conch, he blows the conch, and calls the boys to a meeting. So you see in this moment that Jack is trying to utilize the rules for what it is that he's doing. I've called an assembly, said Jack, because of a lot of things. And he starts to talk to the group about the beast, and he says, yeah, it's hunting. Yes, the beast is a hunter. And, this makes sense to him because obviously Jack is a hunter. And then he starts to talk about it. And he says, Ralph says my hunters are no good. I've got the conch. Ralph thinks you're cowards, running away from the boar and the beast. Then he goes on and he starts to say, all these things why he thinks that Ralph shouldn't be chief anymore, all the reasons he has against him. And he says he's like Piggy, he says things like Piggy, he isn't a proper chief, and he tries to turn the boys against Ralph by saying that he's like Piggy, who is the agreed upon outcast of the group. He then calls Ralph a coward, and he just keeps attacking Ralph's credibility because he's trying to find a way to overthrow him. He says he's not a hunter, he's never has got us meat, which of course is a contradiction to what Jack has done for the group in that, of course, he has gotten them meat. He says we don't know anything about him, and then Ralph pushes back. He says, talk, who wanted it? Who called the meeting? Jack turns, he's red in the face, and of course we know that this communicates that Jack is embarrassed. And finally, so he holds the conch against his chest with one hand and stabs the air with his index finger. Who thinks Ralph oughtn't to be chief? And he looks for the kids to vote against Ralph. And nobody moves. And the silence continued, breathless and heavy, full of shame. Slowly the red drained from Jack's cheeks and then came back in a painful rush. His gaze avoided the embarrassment of linking with another's eye. He's embarrassed by this defeat again. Still, the boys will not vote Ralph out, even though Jack has built this, seemingly Loctite case against him. So his hands that held the conch shook. So Jack is defeated yet again. And so he laid the conch down with great care in the grass at his feet. The humiliating tears are running from the corner of each eye, and he says, I'm not going to play with you any longer. The word play seems to indicate that this is just a game to Jack. He wants to be king of the mountain, and he keeps losing. He then runs away, and it says the steady fall of his tears. So Jack is really, he's sad, he's frustrated in this moment that he wasn't able to unsee Ralph. So, because he doesn't really think that Ralph deserves it, and he seems to believe that he would be better at it. Ralph speaks to himself, he'll come back. When the sun goes down, he'll come back. So he doesn't really think that Jack has like left them for good. Alright, continuing on. So after Jack leaves the tribe, Golding switches over and he looks at Simon for a little bit. Simon, he goes up to his hangout space in the middle of the island, and he went among the creepers until he reached the great mat that was woven by the open space and crawled inside. Beyond the screen of leaves, the sun pelted down, and the butterflies danced in the middle of their unending dance. Golding is constantly describing that the butterflies dance in this particular space. You also see presently he was thirsty, and then very thirsty. You want to keep note of Simon's physical condition throughout the rest of this chapter because it's significant. Golding then cuts back to Jack. Far off along the beach, Jack was standing before a small group of boys. He was looking brilliantly happy. "Hunting," he said. He sized them up. Each of them wore the remains of the black cap, and ages ago had stood in two demure rows where their voices had been the songs of angels. "We'll hunt. I'm going to be chief. I say this, we're not going to bother about the beast. We're going to forget the beast." They agreed passionately out of the depths of their tormented private lives. They're just so desperate to follow and be led. And then, Jack has this idea. "And about the beast, when we kill, we'll leave some of the kill for it. Then it won't bother us, maybe." Jack tries to create a ritual to control this beast fear. So Jack decides that they're going to go on a hunt, and he finds some pigs, and what you see are that the pigs that they find, the pigs lay bloated bags of fat, sensuously enjoying the shadows under the trees. A little apart from the rest, sunk in deep maternal bliss, lay the largest sow of the lot. She was black and pink, and the great bladder of her belly was fringed with a row of piglets that slept or burrowed or squeaked. What you see is a sow. It's a mother pig. In this moment, she's nurturing her babies, and this really is a sacred image. It's one of the most sacred images that humanity has, is that of a mother, in the act of nursing her baby. There's no more precious moment, more sacred image, and this is what the boys choose to attack. And so really they destroy this ultimate image of purity in attacking this particular sow. What then goes on is this really brutal chase scene where the boys chase this mother pig. At one point, Golding says, "The sow staggered her way ahead of them, bleeding and mad, and the hunters followed, wedded to her in lust, excited by the long chase and the dropped blood." And this "wedded to her in lust" is it's a really intense phrasing, and it's the bloodlust that they're wedded to her with. They're excited by the adrenaline and the bloodlust, and it's very animalistic. As they finally catch up to the sow, she staggered into the open space where the bright flowers grew and the butterflies danced. So really what the boys have done is they've chased her into the clearing just in front of where Simon goes to hang out in the forest, and where he usually goes for some time alone and some peace. And this is the spot where the boys proceed to brutally murder the sow. After they kill her, again, in a very, very mob-like fashion, in a very grotesque manner, Jack holds out his hands and he sees the blood on it. and he giggled and flicked them while the boys laughed at his reeking palms. Then Jack grabbed Maurice and rubbed the stuff all over his cheeks. And, you see them playing with the blood, and this is a contrast to chapter 1 when Jack couldn't bring himself to kill the pig because of what the downward stroke would mean, the taking of a life. He can't because of the unbearable blood in chapter 1. In chapter 4, after he kills his first pig, Jack notices the blood on his hands, and it's said that he grimaced distastefully and then looked to clean them. And so, this moment where he's giggling and flicking the blood is really gross, and it just shows I suppose, a evolution of his tolerance with the blood, now that he delights in it. They keep going, and you see that Roger speaks, and he says chief, and you see that Jack no longer utilizes his own name, Jack. He is now responding to a title, which has more power than his childish name. So Jack really understands how to utilize the image of authority. Then Jack says, we'll leave part of the kill for the beast. He doesn't even actually say the word. He says sharpen a stick at both ends. And the reason why he does this is because one end needs to go into the ground and the other end is to impale the head upon. And this is something to just kind of put in the back of your brain because it will come up again later on in the novel. So Jack spoke loudly. This head is for the beast. It is a gift. And that's fairly intense, fairly bizarre. Golding then switches over to looking at Simon. Simon stayed where he was, a small brown image concealed by the leaves. Even if he shut his eyes, the sow's head remained like an after image. The eyes were dim with the infinite cynicism of adult life. They assured Simon that everything was bad business. So you realize that Simon saw this brutal murder, and you know that Simon's a sensitive guy. He goes into the forest to have some time alone, and instead he sees this murder. And even when he closes his eyes to try and shut it out, that image is burned into his head, so he can't get away from it. It says he looked away, licking his dry lips. And so, again, you're keeping an eye on Simon's physical state, and in this moment, he's dehydrated. He then says to himself, a gift for the beast. Might not the beast come for it? The head, he thought, appeared to agree with him. Run away, said the head silently. Go back to the others. It was a joke, really. Why should you bother? You were just wrong, that's all. A little headache. Something you ate, perhaps. Go back, child, the head said silently. So this really is Simon's internal talking to himself. This voice in his head hasn't yet morphed into the Lord of the Flies character that Golding's about to deliver to you. Simon looked up, feeling the weight of his wet hair, and gazed at the sky. Up there, for once, the clouds were great bulging towers that sprouted away over the island, gray and cream and copper-colored. Even the butterflies deserted the open space where the obscene thing grinned and dripped. So, previous to the pig killing, the butterflies danced in the clearing, and Golding's always describing the butterflies dancing here. And so, when the flies show up, and the pile of guts was a black blob of flies that buzzed like a saw, you see that the butterflies desert the space, and then the flies, which are drawn to death and decay, they show up and they replace the butterflies. You should also notice that here we finally get the black blob. Towards the beginning of the chapter, you saw the white blob with the conch, and now you actually see the words black blob. And again, like this use of the word blob is really quite bizarre for Golding, who uses a lot of, bigger words like phosphorescence and efflorescence and, inescapable. He uses these much bigger words. So to see the word blob there is really quite strange for him. And at the end of the chapter, when we've seen this pighead in action, we'll think about the connection between a white blob and the black blob. So, and in front of Simon, the Lord of the Flies hung on his stick and grinned, and his gaze was held by that ancient inescapable recognition. In Simon's right temple, a pulse began to beat on the brain. So again, you're seeing that Simon's physical state is starting to degenerate a bit. He's feeling like, there's a pulse beating in his brain. He's more cognizant that something's going on with his head. In the meantime, Ralph has a conversation with Piggy, and he says to Piggy, "I'm scared." And when Piggy looks at him, he says, "Not of the beast, I'm scared of that too, but nobody else understands about the fire. If somebody threw you a rope when you were drowning, if a doctor said, 'Take this because if you don't take it, you'll die,' you would, wouldn't you, And Piggy responds, "Of course I would." And Ralph says, "Can't they see? Can't they understand? Without the smoke signal, we'll die here. Look at that." So Ralph can't understand why the boys focus on anything but the fire, because for Ralph, like, getting off the island is tantamount. It's the most important thing. And so Ralph, having begun this business of unburdening himself, continued, "Piggy, what's wrong?" And Ralph's not asking him, Piggy, what's wrong with him? He's like, what's wrong with the group? And Ralph says, "No, not it, not the beast. What makes things break up like they do?" And really what Ralph is asking is the central question of the text. Why can't society just work? Why does society break up? What creates these problems? And of course, Piggy rubbed his glasses slowly and thought. Remember, these glasses are the symbol of moral clarity. And so, Ralph's asked a moral question. Piggy tries to clean the glasses in order to have this insight. When he understood how far Ralph had gone toward accepting him, he flushed pinkly with pride. Even though everything is in utter turmoil at this moment, Piggy has this small victory in that Ralph actually values his opinion and is seeking it out in this moment. And, Ralph is the same kid who wanted absolutely nothing to do with Piggy in the very beginning. And all Piggy wanted was to be friends with Ralph. And so this is this small moment of victory for him. And of course, right after Ralph is asked, why can't society get along? And Piggy's feeling this brief moment of acceptance, you see that the forest near them burst into uproar. Demonic figures with faces of white and red and green rushed out howling, so the little ones fled screaming. So as the boys of Jack's tribe have burst in on Ralph and Piggy in this conversation, and they've come to steal the fire so that they can cook the pig for their feast, because they realize they don't have Piggy's glasses. They have no way of actually starting their own fire. Then the three others stood still, watching Ralph, and he saw that the tallest of them, stark naked save for paint and a belt, was Jack. And Jack says to all the other boys, me and my hunters were living along the beach by the flat rock. We'll hunt and feast and have fun. If you want to join my tribe, come and see us. Perhaps I'll let you join, perhaps not. He paused and looked around. He was safe from shame or self-consciousness. Again, he's returned to the side of the island where, he was not voted chief twice. And so hiding behind that paint, he doesn't feel this shame or self-consciousness. Behind the mask of his paint, he could look at each of them in turn and not feel the shame that they're seeing Jack's face. Jack then says, "Tonight we're having a feast. We've killed a pig and we've got meat. You can come and eat with us if you like." Then Jack was waiting for something. He whispered urgently to the others. Remember, there's two boys standing on either side of him. "Go on, now," says Jack. The two savages, notice Golding uses this term savages to refer to the two boys standing next to Jack. They're painted, so Piggy and Ralph can't tell who they are, so Golding just refers to them as savages. Jack spoke sharply, "Go on." The two savages looked at each other, raised their spears together, and spoke in time. "The chief has spoken." Again, Golding has stripped their identities from them. They are just savages at this point. And so the two boys refer to "the chief has spoken." So he's no longer Jack. Jack is conscious of the image of leadership. He's flanked by soldiers, and he realizes that there's more power and command in the term chief than Jack. And so he switches how the kids refer to him. You then switch back over to Simon, and at this point you see that the Lord of the Flies is personified, and it's actually now its own character. And during this conversation between Simon and the Lord of the Flies, you should keep track of Simon's physical state. It's kind of the key to what's going on here. So, the Lord of the Flies says, "You are a silly little boy," said the Lord of the Flies, "just an ignorant, silly little boy." Simon moved his swollen tongue, but said nothing. "Don't you agree?" said the Lord of the Flies. "Aren't you just a silly little boy?" "Well then," said the Lord of the Flies, "you better run off and play with others. They think you're batty." "You don't want Ralph to think you're batty, do you? You like Ralph a lot, don't you? And Piggy, and Jack?" Simon's head was tilted up slightly. His eyes could not break away from the Lord of the Flies' hanging space before him. "What are you doing out here all alone? Aren't you afraid of me?" Simon shook. "There isn't anyone to help you, only me, and I'm the beast." Simon's mouth labored, brought forth audible words. "Pig's head on a stick." "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill," said the head. For a moment or two the forest and all the other dimly appreciated places echoed with a parody of laughter. "You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you? Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are the way they are." The laughter shivered again. "Come now," said the Lord of the Flies. "Get back to the others, and we'll forget the whole thing." Simon's head wobbled. His eyes were half closed, as though he were imitating the obscene thing on the stick. He knew that one of his times was coming on. The Lord of the Flies was expanding like a balloon. "This is ridiculous. You know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there, so don't try to escape." Simon's body was arched and stiff. The Lord of the Flies spoke in the voice of a schoolmaster. "This has gone on far enough. My poor misguided child, do you think you know better than I do?" There was a pause. I'm warning you. I'm going to get angry. Do you see? You're not wanted. Understand? We're going to have fun on this island. Understand? We're going to have fun on this island, so don't try it on, my poor misguided boy, or else. Simon found he was looking into a vast mouth. There was a blackness within, a blackness that spread. Or else, said the Lord of the Flies, we shall do you, see? Jack and Roger and Maurice and Robert and Bill and Piggy and Ralph, do you see? Simon was inside the mouth. He fell down and lost consciousness. Okay, so if you keep track of Simon's physical state, you can see that his head was tilted slightly up. He shook. His mouth labored. His head wobbled. He knew that one of his times was coming on, and his body was arched and stiff. And what you see here is that he's having a seizure. It says he knew that one of his times was coming on. So this indicates that this is a chronic physical issue for him. He can predict it. He senses when he's about to seize. And if you take a look at the head tilted up and he shakes, his head wobbles, his body is arched and stiff, Simon has a seizure. He's an epileptic. And in chapter 1, Jack indicates this. When Simon faints after they first marched in, Jack says, he's always throwing a feint. And he lists like 5 or 6 places that Simon has fainted and done this. So Simon has seizures. He has fits. In classic literature, seizures in characters was often thought to indicate that they were prophetic, that they could make prophecy, that they had some sort of insight into future happenings. And though Golding isn't trying to use Simon to foretell the future, you know that Simon always has the correct interpretation of what's going on. Simon never believes in the beast. Simon always has the correct insight into what the beast really is. He says, maybe there is a beast, maybe it's only us. Simon says, he couldn't conceive of a beast that could fly, that wasn't fast enough to catch Sam and Eric. And I think it's in chapter 6-7, he says that however he thought of the beast, he could only picture a human at once heroic and sick. And this is a reference to the beast of chapter 6, who is a fighter pilot. And he's dead, so he's sick, and he's heroic. He's a soldier, so he's a hero to, one side of this war. So, Simon does seemingly have insight into the scene, but really, this whole conversation with the pig head is a hallucination that he has during the seizure. And really, all that the Lord of the Flies does is the character seems to vocalize the inner thoughts that Simon has about the beast. But it then starts to get at something else. The beast says, fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. And you want to keep that in mind because in chapter 10, look for who else says this idea that the beast is unkillable. The Lord of the Flies also says, you knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. I'm the reason why it's no go. And really this reaffirms the idea that the beast is the boys. And this I'm the reason why it's no go, it answers Ralph's question, what makes things break up? What's wrong with the group? And this is the answer to it, that the beast is, what's wrong with it? And the beast, if you think back to its origins, born out of a nightmare from a little boy, the beast is born out of the boy's fear. It's born out of the fear of the unknown. and their minds have really let this fear get out of control. The beast also says, you know, you're not wanted, understand? We're going to have fun on this island. We're going to have fun, so don't try it on. And Simon's not wanted because he ruins the fun. He uses logic, and so he ruins the fun of the adventure on this island. The titillation brought on by the fear because he introduces logic. You know, he says what the beast actually is. The final thing to note at the end of this chapter is that Golding ends it with Simon staring into the mouth of the beast. And it says Simon was inside the mouth. He fell down and lost consciousness. And this is not obviously literal. Simon's head is not inside the pig head on a stick. It's figurative. Simon is staring. He's inside the mouth. And this puts forth an image of Simon being swallowed by the beast. And when you read chapter 9, you should keep an eye out for mouth imagery. You should watch for how the beast seemingly literally swallows Simon. So you need to look for this. You need to look for the beast image and how it does in fact swallow Simon, because his doom is foretold in this moment. The beast is going to swallow him up, and that's exactly what happens in chapter 9. Last bit of this is to look at the significance between the white blob and the black blob. So again, Golding uses frequently, I don't know, more fancy words. And so the fact that he uses the word blob, he uses it, I believe, only 2 or 3 times throughout the entire novel. And once is in reference to the white blob, which is the symbol of the conch, and the other is a black blob, which is a reference to the Lord of the Flies, the pig head covered in flies. And so it's just not coincidental that he uses the same word to reference 2 of the most major symbols of the novel. So he ties them together with the word blob, and he sets them in opposition to one another with oppositional colors. You know, white and black are often set to indicate the opposite of each other. If you consider the word blob, it means that something is amorphous, that it's without definite shape. You think that the white blob is the conch, which represents Ralph's power and the group's order. And if you think about the conch, Ralph's power, and the group order being amorphous and without definite shape, that's a fairly bad thing, you know, for that symbol. Like, Jack's power is losing shape. The group's order is losing shape. These are terrible things for that. However, on the other side, you have the black blob represented by the pig head, which it's the beast, right? So it's mankind's essential illness that Simon has tried to explain in chapter 5. And really, the beast is born out of fear. The pig head is produced out of violence. And so if you think about what it means to be without definite shape and amorphous, if you're dealing with like fear and violence, then that sort of lack of definition, that chaos, is actually going to invigorate these negative energies. And so while the blobbiness, you know, shows the decline of the conch, the blobbiness is actually going to give energy to and give rise to the symbol of the Lord of the Flies. It's going to give rise to the beast. Well, I hope that gives you a little bit more understanding into chapter 8 of Lord of the Flies, and I hope it was helpful.